off to the Spring 2014 lecture series here at W. Sheboygan. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Ann Mannis. She is our Assistant Professor of English. Dr. Mannis has a PhD in English Literature with a concentration in Women's Studies from Loyola University in Chicago. Her book project is focused on servants in modern, early 20th century literature, but she has a current interest in the servant, which has led her to look at more contemporary representations. Before settling in at her appointment at UW Sheboygan, she taught in the honors program at Marquette University and in the English and Women's Studies departments at UW Milwaukee. So please, everyone, welcome Dr. Ann Mannis.
Thank you, Carrie, for that lovely introduction, and for all of you for braving the, cold February weather that we've been having to come out tonight. I just want to begin really by just talking a little bit about what drew me to this topic. It begins with a very academic origin, actually. It's my preteen crush on Scott Baio. Is anybody familiar with this really fine program, Charles in Charge? I actually watched a really obscene amount of television growing up in the 80s. And one of the things that I noticed, well, a lot later, right, is that there was a really strong theme in the programs that I was watching. Most of them were family sitcoms. And the thing that they all had in common is that many of them had basically live-in domestic servants, or the whole premise of the show was about a live-in domestic worker in the house. Okay, so even though there were family sitcoms, there was always this kind of reoccurring theme. So, for example, we have here the Give Me a Break, which is sort of the whole premise is on this kind of interracial dynamic in the household. That, of course, has a long history we're going to come back to, with Nell Harper caring. She's a sort of feisty African-American domestic who works for a cop. He was widowed, and he has, this, I think, 4 kids, is it? And, you can't forget the Nanny, right? If anybody's seen the Nanny, it's a program that, is sort of premised on this very comic Queens nanny who comes and works for a very wealthy family on the Upper East Side, and she eventually actually marries her employer, and becomes a sort of the stepmom to the kids that she cares for. So right here, even in this dichotomy, similar premise, you already have some very clear kind of social implications at work, right? There's absolutely no romantic possibility between Nell Harper, the African-American woman, and the white cop, right? But there's that barrier gets crossed here, even in the Nanny, right? Where you have, so it's almost as if the interclass barrier is more fluid, right? Or there's a way in which that romance can take place. So I guess even at this level we see. There's similarities and there are differences in the kinds of patterns that we're seeing in these figures. The other, big trend in 80s comic sitcoms was the Nanny, right? With Tony Danza, who's the boss, right? Who works for Connecticut. She's basically, she's a career woman, 80s career woman. Shoulder pad wearing, kind of businesswoman in the 80s, right? And she's got her kids, and they have a kind of blended family. He brings his girl from the Bronx, their Italian-American family from the Bronx, and he takes on all of these traditionally feminine roles as a caregiver. And we have my favorite show, Charles in Charge, right? Which is, in this show, he's a college student or something, I think, and he basically lives in exchange for room and board. He takes care of the kids. Okay. Let's not forget the butlers, or the kind of these figures as well. We have Jeffrey from Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, who works for an African-American family, well-off African-American family. He's very sort of snooty. And we also have Mr. Belvedere, right? Does everyone remember Mr. Belvedere? Okay, anybody? Which is a show about he's he's a very high-class housekeeper who, you know, works for this middle-class family like outside of Pittsburgh. Okay, and the story it's based off of a novel that, you know, in the 1940s was very popular, and they adapted it to this comic sitcom in the 80s. Okay, so, you know, my question here is, you know, what do all of these things have in common? And I think what they all have in common is that these are absolute fantasies, right? There's no verisimilitude here. There's no way in which these characters or the whole premise of this, you know, live and help reflected my reality at all, right? As a middle class, you know, girl, you know, growing up in the suburbs, I didn't know anybody who had a butler, right, in their house, right? I mean, that's kind of why the shows are funny and idiosyncratic, right? They have this quirky presence that is very different, right, and goes against the norm. But I think, despite them having absolutely bearing no real reflection on reality, right, they're very significant. And they also, as I'm going to go and talk about, they're a part of a tradition of representation of the domestic worker, of servants. So what all of them kind of expose is that there's a kind of curious pattern here going on, right? And this is a slide that I actually just showed in my Rebels class, right? On one hand, we have a kind of staple of the cultural imaginary, right, in the United States, which is the nuclear family, right? And the ideal is that this is, you know, existing in a nuclear bubble. And then you always have this sort of the appearance of this outsider who perforates that bubble, right? Who in some ways is like a kind of interloper in this privatized sphere of the family, of the American family. This, to me, has always seemed to be a contradiction that, you know, should result in further critical inquiry, right? What is this fascination with the domestic worker? What is our need to have this presence in the American home? So what I would like to think about is two ways in which these depictions are significant. And first I'll talk about how there are clear patterns here. There's consistency across time and even cultures in depictions of servitude and servants. But I also want to emphasize that there's very culturally specific and historical trends going on as well. Okay, and so that's, you know, something that both kind of historians and literary scholars have been drawn to. Is this kind of twofold thing going on, which is that there's an archetype, which I'll go on to talk about, of the servant figure, and there's also a lot of cultural specificity as well, kind of inherent in this figure. So really, how do I enter this conversation and I'm not going to talk too much about my research at all, or my book project. This was my dissertation, which is now being refined and polished into a book project. And it's focused really on this period between 1900 and 1935, roughly. And it looks at 20th century American fiction by women writers specifically. And this is the book, project title. Okay, and you'll see. I'm just going to really, in one slide, kind of encapsulate what I'm doing in this. Okay, so for my argument is essentially this. That the servant figure reflects, in the modern era, right, certain social trends and fears. Okay, really, the social trend really is that women's employment opportunities expanded greatly at this time period. So the major shift was that women predominantly worked in domestic-oriented professions and then moved toward expanding those opportunities with, as a result of technology, the rise of sort of consumerism, all these different things. They, got opportunities like working not just in factories, but also clerical jobs. Women were identified with secretarial work, the typists, right? Shop girl. All of these were feminized professions that were new professions that women had, were available to women. So I'm looking at kind of how this, disavowing or rejecting this servitude became a very large part of becoming basically modern or identifying with modernity for women in the United States. And so the other thing that I'm interested in looking at is how all of a sudden, because we have immigrants and African Americans predominantly, in those in the domestic service profession, we also have a lot of panic surrounding the domestic service profession at this time. So the middle class home becomes a kind of interracial, interclass contact zone that has to be, in some ways, managed, right? And so, on one hand, these representations that I look at express and kind of deal with, and sometimes reject, the racism and xenophobia, okay? But they also express and evoke a kind of newfound progressivism. So all of this, I think, has the service industry has a lot to do with these different trends happening in American culture. So what I'd like to, just by giving you some idea of what my project deals with specifically, I'd just like to basically get you to kind of engage in these kinds of questions, which is what I've tried to engage as a scholar, and that is, how do servants relate to real systems of social organization and structures of power? If these servants don't resemble reality, right, there is no English butler, right, in the average middle-class American home, then why, what are they doing there? Like, what kind of cultural work, cultural fantasies are they, repositories for, or reflections of? So for me, I'm interested in kind of how do these relate to the actual wage economy? How do they, changing family dynamics, shifts in gender, race, class relations, government law? And really also the second question here, right? Ultimately, what values, virtues, fears, ideals do domestic workers reflect about cultures in a given historical moment? What are they repositories for? And so this comes back to this question of, the servant as archetype. And really just an archetype, if you're not familiar with that term, is has to do with, recurring symbols, motifs, or a kind of character type in literature or stories more broadly, okay? So just, really patterns in representation. So what's important about patterns, right, or the archetype is that, again, they're teaching us something, right? They're giving us, they have a didactic purpose. They're, in some ways, exposing truth, okay? So one scholar who's been a sort of leading voice on this in servant studies is Bruce Robbins, and he wrote a book called In a Servant's Hand, is what his book is called. And he basically argues that, he tracks things all the way from the Homeric epics till, really modern texts. And he says basically servants are historically very one-dimensional characters. They're minor characters. They're usually kind of obsequious, resistant toward social equality and modernity. In that way, they're very anachronistic. They don't, like Mr. Belvedere in the 1980s suburban home, right? He's preserving a kind of pomp and circumstance that is outdated, right? That doesn't seem to make sense, right? So they're, in that way, they seem to be invested in a kind of maintenance of class hierarchy or status hierarchy. They're just accessories to their masters and employers. But he also argues that even though they seem like very kind of conservative figures, there are also moments in the text where they stand in for the people, right? Especially when you're looking at older texts, there isn't a lot of representations of the common folk, right? It's usually about parlors and, you know, the elite. And so where you have these like minor servant characters, in some ways they're standing in for the rest of us. They're standing in for the common folk. And in that sense, there's something democratizing about the rise of the servant figure in literature, okay? So we're familiar, you know, many of us are probably familiar with the Christian archetypes. And of course we have, you know, the kind of language of servitude and the tropes of servitude that are just all over the Bible, right? We're called upon as Christians to be servants of God, right? So that language is already it has a kind of a didactic purpose. It's teaching us something, right? We're held up to, in some ways, the ideals of servitude, or we have been in many different ways. And so this goes back to really some of the earliest literary archetypes we have, right? We have, you know, in Homer, right, the strong connection between, and the bond between his wet nurse and himself, right, and who also is a witness to his son. And so they kind of come in to stand in for virtue, like pure virtue and subservience and loyalty, right? In the Old Testament, Abraham's best servant, right, goes out and finds a wife for his son, Isaac, right? So they're deployed in certain ways that allow them to stand in for pure virtue. We also see them in other forms, okay? For instance, Shakespeare, right? The servant figures all over Shakespearean texts. The wet nurse in Romeo and Juliet is a better, in some ways, she shows more love and care and devotion to Juliet than her own mother does, right? And in many ways, this relationship between paid caregiver and child, or where it is looked at as kind of the most deep, pure form of intimacy, right? And kind of that's a continuing trend in archetypes of servants. We also have this other trend, of course, in fairy tales. Cinderella, she's a servant. Now, it's important that she's not really a servant, right? She's not behind that, you know, she's got prestigious ancestry, right? Which makes it okay for her to end up marrying the prince and yada, yada, yada. But, you know, so there are different ways in which these things play out. But it's a servant archetype nonetheless. The other way in which servitude gets depicted is through the comic archetype. Shakespeare, you know, the comic servant is all over Shakespeare, right? But, you know, this stretches all the way to contemporary representations. How many people are fans of Downton Abbey? Raise your hand. Okay. So, yeah, right, the silly, quirky comic relief, you know, they become a kind of mouthpiece for that, right? And, you know, for Shakespeare, you know, this, and also probably to some extent in Downton Abbey, but it's a way in which, in some ways, you can allow for hierarchies to be challenged, right? We have a lot of instances where masters dress up as servants and servants dress up as masters, and so there's all these kind of carnivalesque twists as well. So there's a lot of things that go on. You know, this is very broad strokes, but just to give you a sense of the range in which these archetypes play out. One of my favorite archetypes, as my students who are in my Gothic class know, maybe a couple of you are in here, is the Gothic archetype. Hitchcock fans will know Rebecca, right? And these aren't great representations here, where the servant becomes kind of representative of a repressed, dark past or truth. We often have servants appearing as ghosts, right? So, you know, like Turn of the Screw, Henry James, right? So we have this kind of darkness or deviance that gets associated with servants as well, as kind of the opposite, right? The virtue and the vice, right? We see them kind of occupying both those extremes. And then if you're, again, a Downton Abbey fan, you know, I feel that Sarah O'Brien, she's no longer now, she left, right? But she kind of is a part of that trajectory, right? She, you know, is the one who puts the soap, you know, in the bathtub. So her mistress loses, you know, she miscarries and falls in the tub. So she has that kind of deviant edge to her. But, you know, these are part of a longer history of representation that are important to consider. In the United States, I think it's impossible not to talk about the racist caricatures, okay, of African Americans. They're very often servants or slaves, okay, and, you know, beginning with the kind of white Southern propaganda as a backlash to Reconstruction. You know, there was a kind of urgency to depict African Americans as one-dimensional, subservient, stupid, comic. These caricatures, right here we have the Mammy, a kind of grotesque caricature, or, you know, example of the Mammy caricature on the left here. And this is Uncle Tom. This is from Uncle Tom's Cabin. So kind of a flattening of, you know, these characters are very flat. They tend to be very subservient, very one-dimensional. And, you know, all the traits that get blown up here are things that really suggest their social inferiority, inherent defects, and thus they kind of encouraged a kind of submission to white authority. And we see that in film, and I knew this wasn't going to turn out perfectly great, but two very clear examples of this is the comic Mammy figure, Hattie McDaniel, in Gone with the Wind. And this is one of the more, I think, memorable film slides here, where you have her tying the corset of Scarlett O'Hara. And, you know, this is now looked at as, you know, really a way in which, you know, the Mammy figure is, you know, represented through her body type and her kind of comic maternal disposition. She's in stark contrast to the white Southern belle, right? She's there as a kind of, you know, counterpoint to this figure, this heroine. And this one, which you can't see, unfortunately, is a slide from Imitation of Life, which is, I write on this in my book project. It's Louise Beavers, who plays Delilah, and she's actually rubbing the feet of her employer, kind of, but essentially they're two women. And at the time, it was considered a very progressive depiction because it was a black and a white woman living together, raising their children together. There was more of a friendship relationship here, as well as a kind of employer-employee relationship. But you know, the kind of sentimentalism and the one-dimensionality of the character gets inflated at the expense of her complexity, right? So now this leads to kind of what I guess I was, you know, maybe drew you into this presentation, which is the figure of the nanny and the governess, which I feel are a part of the same, a very distinct archetype and trajectory in representations of servants. And, you know, I think many of us will know the Jane Eyre, right? The famous novel by Charlotte Bronte. And, you know, this is not just in Jane Eyre. The governess at the time was a very, very popular character in Victorian literature. And Mary Poovey, who's a famous scholar of Victorian literature, essentially says that, you know, it's no coincidence that all of a sudden at this moment everyone wanted to read about the governess and, you know, get into the head of the governess. And for her, it had everything to do with the fact that, you know, the governess has a kind of awkward position in a household, right? She is in many ways a lady, she's educated, but she's not a part of the family. She's a woman and kind of held up to certain traits of, you know, feminine gentility, right? But she's also earning a wage, right? So she's not fitting into the Victorian ideals of womanhood neatly at all, right? She's and so she was a source of anxiety at the time, but she was also a very, you know, she was an object of sympathy. And in many ways, what her argument is that she kind of consolidates a middle-class consciousness in England, right, because of her in-between status, right? Middle-class readers identified with her, right? And it also, there's, you know, a kind of spy-like quality associated with the governess. She's, you know, gives us a window into a world that is removed to the average person, right? She has access to a kind of luxurious elite society, but she's also outside of it. So that is something that's very attractive to a middle-class reader. So, which I will restrain in this slide here. So, in many ways, the governess has middle-class appeal. She's, you know, has a window into the elite household. She serves as a kind of spy into the world of the wealthiest and most powerful. And, you know, the question is whether or not this figure is more progressive than some of these earlier caricatures that we see. You know, is the nanny or the governess then, is she, you know, representative of a shift in our attitudes toward class or gender or what have you? And, you know, this is something that, you know, is really up to, you know, in some ways up to all of us to think about. So, Mary Poppins. And this is, you know, maybe I'll come back to you guys now, your knowledge of these, you know, popular, I'll give you your Mary Poppins quiz now. So, you know, we're talking about what these characters represent, what they teach us, what they stand in for, what values they stand in. So we have Mary Poppins. Does anybody want to take a shot? Like, what role, do you remember what lesson does she teach the Banks, the household that she works for? What is she, do you know? Do you remember? What is she? Supercalifragilistic, right. She goes in there and she does what?
Lightens them up.
She lightens them up. Do you remember what the Banks household is like?
Stiff.
Yeah.
It's very conflicted, like everyone is kind of against one another. She brought them together more.
Okay, she creates unity in the household. He's a corporate banker, and he runs his house like that. So the domestic sphere kind of reflects that, the rigidity of the office, right? And, you know, time. He's very obsessed with time and schedules and routines, right? And then you have Mary Poppins, who comes in and she brings everybody up, right? And she becomes. She basically gets people to think imaginatively again, right? And to think she's really she stands in for spontaneity and all these other different qualities. We have another famous governess. What does she teach? What lesson does she teach the Von Trapp family? Kind of have a similar situation here, right? We have the Von Trapp family, who is, how does he teach? What is he like as a father? If you remember, he makes them all like line up, and he uses a whistle. Yeah, he uses a whistle. Okay, he's like he's very strict, authoritarian. Now this is, poor guy lost his wife, and he has like how many kids? Like 1,000 or whatever. So he's doing what he thinks is going to work. He's applying the principles of the public sphere into the private sphere. So it's a very similar narrative to Mary Poppins, right? So that the domestic sphere is polluted by the public, and the nanny comes in and she cleanses the home of those pollutants, those public pollutants. So in the case of the banks, right? Take the office out of the house, right? We can't live by these binding rules. We need to think like a child and have imagination like children, and so they become really the domestic salvation of these households. The other kind of specter that's in the background of this movie is what? The rise of fascism, right? That's what this story is about, ultimately, is their conflicted relationship to fascism. And so, his militant and authoritarian way of running his household also disturbingly resembles that, right? And so she comes in and injects a kind of democratic way of thinking. So it's not just about, okay, she lightens it up and she teaches kids how to sing and she brings music back to the household, a kind of soul back to the household. She's also democratizing the household, right? She's allowing the family to kind of reject the rise of fascism, essentially. So the question is whether or not these characters, they're teachers, and they probably teach relatively good things. It's but the question is, are these really radical teachers? Are they rebels in some ways? Are they do they then become figures of a kind of domestic rebellion, or to these like larger systemic things that were going on, right, in the background of the house? We are going to take a look at kind of updated version of this governess figure, and one of them is the Nanny Diaries, which was a very, very popular novel a couple years back, and then the film, which we're going to watch the trailer of right now. And I thought it might be fun to take a look at that, because I've been talking now for 35 minutes. So that, and I'm not going to say anything about the Au Pair 3, but it's essentially just a contemporary reconfiguration of The Sound of Music, except it's a little. Obviously it's updated. She's the nanny and she marries the dad, but she also starts to work for him. So she also is kind of has her own professional thing going on. I think this is an interesting twist on it. So if you haven't seen the Nanny Diaries, this is all you pretty much need to see. I don't recommend anyone seeing the Au Pair, any of them. I've watched all 3 of them, I'm ashamed to say, but so Nanny Diaries.
Child rearing around the world boasts a wide variety of customs and mores.
Stop eating them boogers!
In Africa, they have a saying, it takes a village to raise a child. But for the tribe of the Upper East Side of Manhattan, it takes just one person. The nanny.
Dear Nanny, welcome on board. Please make yourself at home. Nanny? What are you doing? This is your room.
Oh, very sweet.
This spring.
Why don't we race to the front door?
Oh my God! That's my finger! Ow!
I am not letting go until you open the door!
Pardon me. I think this belongs to Grayer.
I'm the ex's new nanny.
Oh,
Very new.
I'm taking off all my clothes.
Seems to be popular on this floor.
Nanny, today is the 4th of July party. Costumes are required.
What's wrong? Why won't you shake your booty?
Because I have to make a duty.
Oh, the elevator!
Nanny,
Tonight, in the morning, I need you to stop at Tiffany's and pick up Mr. X's watch. Then I need you to Xerox some recommendation letters for Grayer's collegiate application. Also, we should introduce French food into his diet. It might enhance his study of the language. Dry cleaning.
Hey.
What are you doing here? Get out of here right now.
Not until you agree to see me.
He's a little out of your league, don't you think?
You gotta quit. It's just that simple.
I would love to quit, but I can't leave Grayer with that woman.
Look, it is yoga hour, and Mommy is on the phone.
Scarlett Johansson, Laura Linney, Alicia Keys, Chris Evans.
I don't know what's gotten into her lately. I installed a nanny cam.
Aha! Okay, lady, I'll give you Nanny's Gone Wild.
In a comedy about life at the top as seen from the bottom.
I believe this videotape shows her feeding my child peanut butter and jelly directly from the jar.
Heads up, lady. Try smiling once in a while. People hate you.
The teddy bear has been compromised.
The Nanny Diaries.
All right, so you get the picture. How this movie? How many people have seen this movie? Raise your hand. Okay, only a couple of you. It's funny, actually. It's a funny book, and it's a funny movie. And I think it's hopefully we will have a little bit of time for discussion. So we might think about the implications of that particular film, but it's taking the nanny, the governess figure, the kind of Mary Poppins figure into a whole other realm here. But what's it's a continuous kind of trend, and I think in some ways a disturbing trend about the kinds of stories we gravitate toward, is that the figure that we tend to gravitate toward, is the governess, the nanny, or the au pair, right? Which is very different from other kinds of care workers, right? She tends to be white, of European descent, middle class, educated. Her post is temporary, right? So she's going to go on to bigger and better things. If you didn't get that from the trailer, she ends up hooking up with the cute, like, Princeton grad or whatever in the town, or in the building where she works. Okay, so she has an upward mobility that the average care worker doesn't necessarily have. Right, this is a very small demographic if you look at the real economy and the real women that are employed in care work, and it's on the margins of the film, right? You even saw that a lot of the Caribbean nannies. There was like the booger, right? So in the film, she seems to make reference to that. She understands herself as different from the women who are kind of like living there, maybe with family, with their own children in the Caribbean, sending money back to their families, right? In much more complicated economic situations. We also have the help, right, which is another phenomenon, a recent phenomenon, right? And this is something that that begs a lot of questions as well. And again, I hope if these are things that are interesting to people or they watch it, we can have a conversation about it. One of the controversies about this film is that it's some people loved it, and see it as a very progressive kind of reflection of the rise of kind of civil rights and how this domestic service industry in the South fit into that. And others saw this as just an updating of the mammy white family dynamic, where we have a Aibileen who's very sentimental and very connected to the white child, right? And there's a kind of idealization of her. And some people argue that she's represented as in very flat ways, very one-dimensional ways. There's a lot of discussion of that. So we're going to, in this kind of reflect, and the writer was reflecting on kind of her own experience as a white woman being raised by black help, right, which is different than a story being told from a person who experienced it on the other side, right? I was in New York a few weeks ago, and I was so happy to find that there was this exhibit called The Substitutes. It was a woman who was a New Yorker who also was raised by an African-American domestic, and she made a whole series of photographs where she depicted, not always, but basically Caribbean nannies, which is the largest demographic who work in New York. And she just went around and took pictures of them with their working, right? And what was so interesting about that, this was just one of them, there's a series of them, is that it totally, these pictures totally deflate the sentimentalism, right, that you see in the depictions of the mammy, right? Just the gaze on the woman's face, right? I mean, there's I don't know, the emotion that is evoked from these photographs is much more realistic, right? In terms of what those kinds of caregiving relationships and the labor involved in that work, right? So the question then, and this is how I'm going to end, is, you know, there's a gap, right? There's a real clear gap, I think, between the way that nannies are represented popularly and the way they represent themselves. You know, and so what does that mean, right? What are some different ways in which they, how do they highlight their experiences? What kinds of things do they highlight about their experience? And, you know, what exactly does this gap between the fantasy nannies and the real nannies mean, right? And, you know, hopefully we'll have some questions here. And this is my second clip. I made sure that my clips were toward the end so that there was some interludes, film interludes. And this is a clip by Kristen Yvette Lewis, who's a strong member of the Domestic Workers United, which is, it's in New York City, similar to the clip we just saw of Nanny Diaries, right? It's set in New York. And they've actually had some pretty amazing, you know, strides in working toward fair labor standards for domestic workers. And this is just a little 2-minute clip that is from the Colbert Report.
Domestic workers are women who work in the homes as elderly caregivers, nannies, and housekeepers/house cleaners.
Why is this necessary? All workers in the United States got rights. Everybody's got this right and that right. Everybody's got special rights. Y'all are protected. Why is this necessary?
It is necessary because women work in isolated places in the home. It's an invisible workforce, and women need to be protected.
What are you talking about? You're not Susan Storm. I can see you. What do you mean you're an invisible workforce?
Yes, I agree. I agree. You can see me, right?
Hello?
Hello. 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 Hello, somebody. But yes, these women work in isolation. Two classes of people who have been historically excluded from labor laws in this country has been farm workers and domestic workers. Why that has been? Because it has been studied in racism. Segregationists, lawmakers in the South, when they had the folks working in the homes who happened to be black domestic workers and black farm workers were vindictively excluded from labor laws. So hello. It has come up through the century. We have to organize for fair labor standards, for power, for respect, because the work we do is real work. It has been deemed unskilled by somebody. I don't know who this person was. My God, if I should find this person. It's not woman's work, it's real work. All right?
Okay, so she's, the full interview is actually really good, but I thought the shorter clip would be better for us. So just even looking at some of these posters from the Domestic Workers United, radically different from the other images that we've seen, right? We have a poster here, how do you benefit from my labor, right? And, you know, the kind of rights, dignity, respect, recognition for domestic workers. This image here, you know, really, you know, profoundly, you know, oriented toward exposing exploitation and drawing awareness to the labor standards, right? The other interesting, and we'll have a couple minutes, because this is the end of it, really the trail end of my talk, is we had this, does anybody know about VIVIAN MAEIR? This is so interesting. Oh, you do?
I read that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I made you. Everybody does, because I made them do it. They're my students. So I gave them a requirement. Yeah, so VIVIAN MAEIR is now, she's so interesting, okay? Essentially, in 2009, she passed away, and she lived in a home, and she was actually, do you guys know Phil Donahue? She was his nanny, okay? She worked on the North Shore of Chicago. She was kind of a recluse. She was very idiosyncratic, and she lived in an attic, and she took pictures for decades. And even the people who she worked for years and years and years didn't even know that she was taking pictures. She was very mysterious, and she didn't even develop most of her pictures. And just a few years ago, after she died, some random guy came across boxes and boxes of undeveloped film, and he bought them at an auction. This was in some random whatever. And he discovered these amazing photographs. And now she's considered probably one of the most important street photographers in, contemporary American circles. And so I'll just show you this trailer. And my interest in this is totally like everyone else's, oh my God, what an amazing story. But my interest is also how people are talking about her story, right? And her photography and her is so fascinating to me. And so here, this is a trailer for Finding VIVIAN MAEIR. So you'll get a better sense of what this is all about.
The auction house is across the street from my home. I found this box loaded with negatives. I won it for, I think it was $380.
The history of street photography is currently being rewritten.
VIVIAN MAEIR.
VIVIAN MAEIR.
VIVIAN MAEIR?
Exhibitions in New York, and LA, and London, and Chicago.
We've had more interest in this work than perhaps any other photographer.
There's one particular that I bought, which I love. The composition is slightly off to me, and I think that's why I like it.
VIVIAN was a very private woman.
She was so awesomely unique.
She was not an open person. She was a closed person.
VIVIAN was my nanny.
Yeah, she was our nanny.
He certainly had no idea that she took photographs.
She lived on the 3rd floor in our attic.
This was the forbidden zone.
One of the first things she asked me for was please to put in a lock.
She said, don't ever open this door.
They didn't know there was this creative person there.
She took so many photos.
Around 100,000 negatives, 700 rolls of undeveloped color film, 8mm and 16mm movies.
She would take us and we would just walk in the worst parts of town.
I think she liked that.
Maybe we just didn't understand her.
What would you say to VIVIAN now?
What drove you to hide yourself away?
I'd say to her, why the why the didn't you ever show me all the stuff you did? I thought I was a friend of yours.
In death, she is getting the fame that she never had in life.
I'm uncovering an artist. If I'm leaving this giant boulder unturned, it would be a mistake.
Of course, she would have hated every minute of it. She would never have let this happen.
She had some compulsive behaviors.
She was a pack rat.
I asked her what she did. Her answer was, I'm sort of a spy.
We would say, what's your name? Miss V. Smith. There's a piece of the puzzle missing.
As she was photographing, she was seeing just how close you can come into somebody's space. That tells me a lot about her. She could get them to accommodate her by being themselves. She could generate this moment, and then she's gone.
Is there anything that you wish was done differently then?
Sure, I wish I would have found those negatives instead of you.
I just want to, she also had self-portraits that were fascinating, right? Again, undeveloped. And so, the question here, that maybe I want to leave us with is this, is that, what about you know, the domestic workers' perspectives and struggles that we see very much foregrounded in these other representations, right, gets lost in the public representation. And found, too. This is just a box of Vivian MAEIR's undeveloped prints, and then on the left is a wonderful painting from the Milwaukee Art Museum by Alison Sayre. It's from 2000. It's called Washtub Blues. And it's, for me, so remarkable because, you know, it's the laundress with her back to the viewer, right? And so is there something radical about refusing to be represented? You know, wanting to have control over your representation. Knowing that, you know, not wanting to reduce yourself to an archetype, not wanting to, you know, not knowing that the public sort of is like, and so he's appropriated and distorted this this particular figure, you know. So I think this is these are kind of an interesting question to leave us with. So if we have like 5 minutes, I guess, left. I had hoped to have maybe 10, but 5 is pretty good, right? Sometimes there's no time, right, Carrie? Is she here? Okay, maybe not.
Go over a little bit.
Okay, well, whatever. I mean, this is so that's my spiel, and so I guess. You know, I'm happy to entertain any questions that you might have. If you want to even just talk about Scott Baio, it's fine too. You know. Or not. We could just.
I think there's something, I don't know, I think it sounded like you were approaching it, but not quite saying that, like a lot of times we know that, like, and I've known people who've been nannies themselves, and it's like they're privately raising these children. They are like parents in private, except for in public, you know, parents take credit for all of the things that the children have, all of their accomplishments and everything, but the nanny is like a surrogate mother for these children, and I don't know where exactly you go with that. Like, you know, I'm sure they feel a connection with these children and pride, but I don't know how, like, I don't know how you would deal with being, like, basically raising children and not getting any credit for it, and sitting, you know, in the shadow and just, I don't know if that's something that, I think some of the movies kind of touch on that. Privately, the surrogate parents.
Yeah, and also the guilt for the parents too. I mean, or that also comes up as well. I mean, feeling like I'm supposed to be the primary caregiver, but you know, we're also in a child care crisis in this country. You know, we have people that have a very hard time. You know, it's having raising a child on a single income is virtually impossible for most people, right? So, you know, and it should be said that to have a nanny already is a big, you know, privilege, right? To have access to high quality child care is a privilege.
Because you forced me to read about Vivian MAEIR. I know a little bit about her history and her backstory. That she came from kind of a broken home. Dad wasn't around, and she kind of lost her mom early on in her life. It seemed like they didn't have much of a relationship. So I don't know. Do you think there's a connection between broken families and taking on that nanny role and jumping into another family?
I mean, it's interesting, yeah. I mean, she, in many ways, like the choice that she made to like live with a family and that was very outdated. You know, there was something very kind of reclusive about her choice. I mean, she theoretically could have like, you know, lived out. I mean, which is the choice that many women choose, right? You know, like to not live with a family and actually have carve out a space of your own. where you may or may not have a child or a family. But, I mean, she's clearly in some ways rebelling. I mean, we were talking about this in my class, that by being a nanny, she's really rejecting certain domestic norms, right? And choosing a life that isn't really about her being a part of this nuclear family, herself, or being, you know, the real mother in that that setup, right?
I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about the ambiguity of the nanny situation being, in some ways, a member of the household, and in other ways, simply a mere employee who could be dismissed, and you know, the ties of love that are there, particularly with the child, and then just the employment, and you're dismissed. Did you see that changing in time from, say, the Victorian novels that you were looking at into the present? Is there a shift?
Well, it's interesting because in some ways, there are certain trends that are persistent. Like even in the Nanny diaries, right? You don't necessarily get a sense of this, but I mean, she comes in there, and just like the Mary Poppins figure, she makes the family learn how to love their son, right? They're so materialistic. They're these Upper East Side, you know, society people, and they don't know what it's not really just about your son learning French. You also need to connect to him on this like organic level, right? And so she teaches the child how to love, and I mean that is a very consistent piece of the early 20th century novels I look at, right? You know, even in the mammy figure, the mammy gets imbued with a kind of emotional capacity that is more intense or more authentic or real, and she has to kind of, in some ways, reform the household and teach them how to love properly. And so, I mean, there's a lot of scholarship on nannies and like real nannies and the kind of labor struggles that are going on, and the very specific kind of emotional alienation that the nanny feels, and how it's a kind of, it takes the, I mean, it's a different kind of labor, and it's a whole other level of alienated labor, if you really think about it, right? Because of this sense of engaging in these activities that are all about love, right? And these things that are supposed to be these sacred kind of things that are partitioned off from public, right? A public wage economy. But you're dispensing those things, right? And so it's, you know, and also it should be said that many nannies, you know, if we're looking at urban places, have children in their home countries that they're sending money back to. So it's, you know, literally they're being surrogate parents, and they're absent parents. I mean, they're, you know, absentee parents for their own children. So it's a real kind of painful kind of labor situation for many women, but the only choice that they can make, right?
Just real quick, I think it's interesting that this critique of materialism keeps coming up in all of these examples, and I don't know if you've looked at Spanglish.
I have, yeah. I saw it many years ago.
Okay.
But yeah.
Because that's one film that I always look at that shows the relationship between the mistress and the servant. But the servant comes in, and she's a Latina servant, and she teaches the white mistress about how she's kind of lost touch with the feminine side.
Yes.
You know, so you have that kind of this critique of materialism and critique of modernity in some sense, but then a reinforcing of traditional feminine.
Yes.
At the same time.
Yeah, and the nanny always gets enlisted to give the makeover of the house. I mean, even in that show, if you've ever seen that show, it's like the British nanny who comes in it's like a real show, the Super Nanny, yeah. And it's amazing what she does to those households, right? But she comes in and everybody's well behaved afterwards. You know, so it's like, you know, even though they're outsiders, they get enlisted to you know, get everything back in the right form, right?
Have sociologists done much with Nanny?
Yes, yes. In fact, much more than literary historians in some ways, in certain ways. And it's a very important topic right now in social sciences for the reasons I talk about, looking at like different demographics and you know, like I think it's like Sri Lanka. It's like 75% of Sri Lankan women live abroad as domestic care workers and just live in domestics. So like the migration, like what, you know, the migratory patterns of domestic workers and all that becomes a very key kind of issue as well.
I think what would be really curious would be to kind of roll with watching at what point along the way each individual in that household recognizes that this person is an employee. And what happens to them when that insight, I mean, the family who hires this person, then this person comes in and invests herself or himself at a level where they almost have to keep reminding themselves that they're just an employee because they may be really involving themselves in emotional relationships. And then the child,
right,
at some point along the way, realizes, boy, this person was paid to do this for me, and so I thought this person loved me. I mean, I'm just kind of curious as to like all of that and how that would flow as those insights come and go.
Yeah, and you know, a lot of work that's been done in the realm of sociology has to do with the emotional labor, right? And you know, like what distinguishes emotional labor from other kinds of labor. You know, it's so taxing, right? It's so complicated and nuanced, and but at the same time, you know, there's the wage relation, right? So it's, you know, it's a really, what is the effective, you know, economy or the sentimental economy of any given household, right? It's always very different, right? Right, right. Well, I think that was, yeah. Thank you so much for staying over my class. Extra credit. Thank you.